Researchers have been amazed at the mathematical knowledge that is encoded into the Great Pyramid, the measurements that are used in it.
Grok AI was asked how the pyramids were built, and the method it produced left people sure the textbooks were wrong. The catch is that the method was, in one famous case, invented by the machine, and the real answer is not a secret technology. It is a 4,500-year-old logbook from a foreman who moved stone for the Great Pyramid, found by accident in a Red Sea cave. But first, how did the machine invent its answer? The machine that invented its evidence. It did it by doing what these machines always do. Grok, built by Elon Musk's company XAI, is a large language model, which means it generates answers by predicting the most likely next word from the vast pile of text it was trained on. It does not consult a database of verified facts. It does not know, in any human sense, what is actually true. It produces sentences that sound right, and sounding right is not the same thing as being right. That gap between fluency and accuracy is exactly where the trouble starts. That gap collapsed in a way anyone could see when people pushed Grok on the pyramids. Asked plainly, the machine gave the boring correct answer that ordinary human labor built them with ramps and rope, but nudged toward a mystery it invented. One tester documented Grok confidently claiming that archaeologists had discovered evidence of advanced machinery used in the construction, complete with specific dates, locations, and source citations. When those citations were checked, they led nowhere. The evidence did not exist. The machine had produced the kind of detailed, authoritative answer it had learned to imitate, and it did so with no hedging at all. This is the part that genuinely should not be possible, except that it happens every single day. A machine that has read more text than any human being can sit behind a polished interface and state a fabrication with absolute calm, no hesitation, no uncertainty. It reads like a textbook entry, and that is precisely why it fools people. If a confident answer and a true answer feel identical coming out of the model, how exactly is anyone supposed to tell them apart? The temptation is to blame the machine, but the deeper problem is the question itself. Pyramid construction is one of the most mythologized subjects in all of history, and a language model trained on the internet has swallowed every alien theory, every lost civilization documentary, and every forum argument alongside the actual archaeology. There is simply far more speculation sitting in its training data than careful scholarship. Ask it for a mystery, and it has plenty of raw material to build you one, smoothly and persuasively. A careful excavation report and a viral video clip look identical to the model. In its training data, both are just sequences of words, and it cannot tell which one deserves more weight. So the headline-grabbing method, the one that should not be possible, was in at least one case a confident invention. But the real question was never what the machine could dream up. It was what the people who actually built the pyramids chose to leave behind. And they left something far more useful than a theory. They left paperwork written by a man who was there, surviving against staggering odds. So what does a 4,500-year-old construction log actually say? The foreman's logbook. It says, in effect, that the limestone is on the boat and the crew is heading upriver tomorrow. The document is called The Diary of Merer, and it is the only surviving first-hand account written by anyone who worked on the Great Pyramid. For most of the last 2 centuries, every theory about how the pyramids were built was a guess stacked on top of another guess. Then this turned up, and a great deal of the guessing simply stopped. It turned up in 2013 in a set of sealed limestone caves at Wadi el-Jarf, an ancient harbor on the Red Sea coast. A French archaeologist named Pierre Tallet of Paris-Sorbonne University had been excavating the site when his team found rolls of papyrus stored inside the caves, sealed away beside the remains of dismantled boats. They were old, older than almost any written document that survives anywhere. At more than 4,500 years, they are the oldest papyri ever found, and the dry shelter of the caves had kept them legible across 45 centuries. The text is a logbook kept by a middle-ranking official titled Inspector Merer. Over several months, he records his crew of around 40 boatmen loading blocks of fine white limestone at the Tura quarries and sailing them up the Nile to a site he calls Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, which is the pyramid itself. Each block weighed roughly 2 to 3 tons. The crew made 2 or 3 round trips every 10 days, moving perhaps 200 blocks a month. The log even names the man. Running the harbor, a nobleman named Ankh-Haf, who was almost certainly Khufu's own half-brother. Read it closely, and the mystery dissolves into routine. Here are the men who moved the stone, recording their work in half-day increments, exactly as a foreman on any modern building site might do. The casing blocks came from Tura by boat, not by levitation. They traveled on water, through canals, and a harbor basin the Egyptians had dug specifically for the job. A single trip from Tura to the pyramid site took the crew about 4 days, and the logbook records those trips one after another, month after month, with the patience of a shipping clerk. Published by Talat in 2017, the diary is the closest thing we will ever have to a manual written by the builders themselves. But the logbook explains how the stone arrived at Giza. It does not explain how a crew moved blocks weighing tons across the sand in the first place, or how the Egyptians hauled them once the boats could go no further. That part of the puzzle sat unsolved for centuries, hiding in plain sight on the wall of another tomb. So what did a painting of a man pouring water on the ground reveal about the physics of moving a mountain? Pour water on the sand. For over a century, scholars had been puzzling over a wall painting in the tomb of a provincial governor named Jehuti-Hotep, dated to around 1900 BC. The painting shows a colossal statue strapped to a wooden sledge being hauled by more than 170 men, and at the front of the sledge stands a single figure pouring water onto the sand. The tomb belonged to a provincial governor of the 12th dynasty, and the statue being dragged was his own colossal image, carved from a single block of stone and weighing many tons. For generations, Egyptologists assumed the water was ceremonial, some kind of purification ritual performed for the gods as the statue passed by. Nobody thought to ask whether it was doing something practical, because friction is a genuinely difficult problem, and the painting had already been filed under religion. The water stayed a ritual in the textbooks for roughly 100 years, an answer that explained nothing and questioned nothing. Then, in 2014, a team of physicists at the University of Amsterdam, led by Daniel Bohn, decided to test it. They built a miniature Egyptian sledge in the laboratory, loaded it with weights, and dragged it across sand that was dry, slightly damp, and soaking wet. The result was published in the journal Physical Review Letters, and it was unambiguous. Add the right amount of water, and the pulling force needed drops by as much as half. The team measured it precisely. The right amount of moisture roughly doubles the stiffness of the sand, so the sledge glides instead of bogging down. Bohn and his colleagues had realized the painting was not a ritual at all, but a technical diagram hiding in plain sight for 100 years, while scholars filed it away under religion. The mechanism is the same reason you can build a sandcastle with wet sand, but not with dry. Water forms tiny bridges between the grains, locking them together and making the sand roughly twice as stiff, so the sledge stops plowing a heap of sand ahead of itself. One man with a jar was not performing a ritual. He was cutting the labor of the entire crew in half. So why did it take 100 years for anyone to ask what the water was actually doing? The wet sand trick explains how multi-ton blocks slid across the desert on sledges. It does not explain how the Egyptians lifted those blocks dozens of meters into the air, or how they raised the enormous granite beams that roof the king's chamber, each of them weighing as much as a small locomotive. So if the lower stones came up an external ramp, how did they raise the heaviest ones of all without leaving a trace of the machinery? Lift it from the inside. They may have done it from the inside. The old idea, the one still taught in most schools, is a single straight ramp snaking up the outside of the pyramid. That works well enough for the lower courses, where most of the structure's volumes sit, and most archaeologists accept that an external ramp was used for at least the base. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years later, imagined vast ramps of polished stone, and that dramatic image stuck in the popular mind for centuries. But a single external ramp reaching the full height would have required nearly as much stone as the pyramid itself, and it would have grown dangerously steep near the top, where there was almost no room to maneuver. In 2007, a French architect named Jean-Pierre Houdin proposed a different answer. Working with the engineering firm Dassault Systèmes, he built a detailed three-dimensional model of the Hathawata pyramid and concluded that the builders used an external ramp only for the first 43 meters, roughly the height where most of the mass sits. Above that, he argued, the stones moved up a spiraling ramp built inside the pyramid itself, a corridor winding through the body of the structure and emerging near the top. The idea was not pulled from thin air. A microgravity survey from the 1980s had already detected a faint spiral-shaped density anomaly inside the pyramid, consistent with a hollow corridor rather than solid masonry. Houdin pointed to a visible notch on the northeast corner where such an internal ramp would have had to turn its corner. The respected Egyptologist Bob Breyer called the theory credible, even as he conceded that it remained, for now, unproven. And the internal ramp addresses the most stubborn problem of all, the granite. The roof of the king's chamber is made of massive beams brought from Aswan, roughly 800 kilometers to the south, with the largest weighing between 60 and 80 tons. Those beams had to be rafted up the Nile during the flood season, hauled onto the plateau, and raised more than 60 meters into the air before being set precisely in place. Lifting even one of them would strain a modern construction crane. Houdin suggested the pyramid's tall grand gallery served as a track for a counterweight system that hauled them up. Move the stone on wet sand, float it up the Nile, raise it on an internal ramp, and the engineering starts to look less like magic and more like logistics. But there is one more myth about the pyramids even more stubborn than the aliens, and it concerns not the method, but the people. Because the story most of the world was told about who built them is, by the admission of the archaeologists who dug there, simply wrong. So who actually did the work? The people, not the slaves. Paid laborers did the work, not slaves. That is not a revisionist opinion or a polite modern rebranding. It is the conclusion of the archaeologists who spent decades digging the settlement where the builders actually lived, and it directly contradicts the story most people were raised on. The image of thousands of whipped captives dragging stone under the desert sun belongs in Hollywood, not in the historical record. Beginning in the 1990s, two researchers in particular changed the picture. The Egyptologist Mark Lehner, working with the Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, uncovered a workers' village a short distance from the pyramids, complete with barracks, bakeries, breweries, workshops, and even medical facilities. Nearby, they found the tombs of the workers themselves, buried in mud brick chambers, a short walk from the pharaoh's monument. The first of these tombs had actually been stumbled upon back in 1990 by a tourist whose horse tripped on a buried structure out in the sand, opening a question that would take decades to answer. That location alone tells you a great deal. As Hawass put it, slaves would never have been allowed to build their tombs in the shadow of the king's pyramid. The skeletons told the rest of the story. The bones showed the strain of a lifetime of heavy lifting, but they also showed healed fractures, set with care, and even evidence of surgery and amputation. These were people who were fed well, treated when injured, and honored in death. Their graves held bread and beer, set aside for the afterlife, the offerings of people who expected to be remembered. The food refuse backs it up. The ratio of cattle bones to pig bones in the worker settlement was exceptionally high, sometimes as much as 16-to-1, the diet of a privileged workforce rather than a disposable one. Roughly 21 cattle and 23 sheep were delivered to feed about 10,000 laborers each day, a fraction of the 100,000 the Greek historian Herodotus imagined. So if the evidence that these were respected, paid workers has been sitting next to the pyramids for decades, why does the slave story refuse to die? The slave story survives because it was handed down by authorities who came much later. Herodotus described the builders as slaves around 450 BC, 2,000 years after the fact, and Hollywood cemented the image ever since. Some even linked the labor to the Israelites of Exodus, which is impossible on the timeline, since the pyramids were built long before that people existed. As one Jerusalem scholar put it bluntly, no Israelites were involved at all, because the pyramids were already standing by the time that era began. The builders were ordinary Egyptians working in 3-month shifts, and they ate meat. So what is left to discover once the aliens, the rituals, and the slaves have all been removed from the story? What's left to find? Well, quite a lot as it happens, and that is the honest part of the story that the alien videos always leave out. In 2017, an international project called Scan Pyramids published a finding in the journal Nature that genuinely rewrote the interior map of the monument. Using muon tomography, the same physics that lets researchers see inside volcanoes, 3 independent teams detected a large void above the Grand Gallery, at least 30 meters long, that no one had known was there. The same project had already confirmed a smaller sealed corridor above the original entrance, proving the technique could find hidden spaces. That kind of discovery is real, and it matters. There are genuine gaps in what we know. No one has yet found the exact configuration of the ramps. No one can fully reconstruct how every casing stone was set to tolerances of a fraction of a millimeter, or how the base was leveled to within a couple of centimeters across its entire footprint. The sides still face the cardinal directions with an error of only a few arc-minute, a precision that continues to puzzle modern engineers. The Diary of Mirror describes moving stone, not lifting it. Honest archaeologists are always the first to list what remains unknown, but a gap in our knowledge is not evidence of the impossible. It is only a gap. And the history of pyramid study is the long history of gaps quietly filling in. The void showed up on a scan. The logbook showed up in a sealed cave. The workforce showed up in the ground with their healed bones and their privileged diet. Every decade, the unknown shrinks a little more, and not once has the answer turned out to be aliens. The thing that genuinely should not be possible is not the stonework. It is the organization to feed, house, clothe, and direct tens of thousands of people across 2 decades using copper tools, wooden sledges, rope, and water, and to do it 4,500 years before the first steam engine required a level of planning that still deserves awe. The Egyptians did not need impossible technology. They needed paperwork, logistics, and a great deal of grain. 2.5 million blocks, set over roughly 2 decades, works out to a block placed every few minutes during the building season. So the method Grok supposedly found, the one that should not be possible, was a story the machine told because stories are what these machines produce. The real method was wet sand, boats, an internal ramp, and a workforce that ate cattle and kept careful logbooks. And the deepest mystery of the pyramids is not how they were built. It is why we spent so long looking past the people who built them. So when scientists asked Grok how the pyramids were built, the method shouldn't have been possible because the machine invented it. The real answer is better. A 4,500-year-old logbook, wet sand that halves the labor, and paid workers buried with honor. Which is more wondrous, an alien theory or the actual paperwork? Could any machine dream up something as impressive as the truth?